Hi everyone, what you're about to watch is an interview I conducted earlier this week with Dr. Ashley Frawley. She is a senior lecturer in sociology and social policy at Swansea University. In the interview, we covered different social impacts this coronavirus outbreak is having and could have on the UK, which I think deserve more discussion. If you enjoyed the interview, I hope you do, then please do subscribe to my channel. Ashley, thanks a lot for agreeing to talk to me today. Um, so, late last month, there was a YouGov survey which showed 93% of Brits were supportive of the government's lockdown measures. How do you, as an expert in sociology and in social policy, interpret that?
Really, was it that much?
Mhm.
I hadn't seen that. I thought the last one I saw was like over half. But anyways, yeah. So, um, it's a very difficult situation. It's obviously unprecedented. Trying to slow or stop, no one's really sure, a virus across the entire planet. It is a pandemic. And so, no one's really sure what to do. There's no government in the world that's figured it out. Certainly in the UK, there's a tendency to take a more precautionary approach to public health issues, which is why I was very surprised at the very beginning that the government announced it appeared to be taking more of a less sort of stringent approach, that they, it didn't appear that they were considering doing a sort of Chinese style lockdown, because historically, it's been a sort of better safe than sorry kind of approach. So if we go back at public health issues, very early on, when there was a public health threat, policymakers would attempt to reassure the public. Very famously, when mad cow disease emerged, a policymaker got his daughter to eat a burger to, alleviate the fears of the public. And that was quite disastrous. That's a little PR stunt. And since then, the lesson has been really that you need to affirm fear, because it's much, much better to be seen to be overreacting to a small threat than to have underreacted to a large threat. And so since then, policymakers' reactions to health threats has been in the affirmative, and to sort of big up potential threats, because it's so politically costly to attempt to alleviate people's fears and then find out actually that it was much worse than it first appeared. And so I was quite surprised when I saw initially that that Johnson was taking this approach that was very reminiscent of the early 1980s or even the late 1970s, where he was saying, I shook hands with all of the patients. Now, of course, the point that he was trying to make there was that about hand washing. But still, the fact that he even said that, it seemed that he was trying to alleviate people's fears instead of asking people to panic, which historically, not panic, but certainly saying, yes, you should be fearful. So that was interesting. But of course, very quickly that turned around. And there's a lot of controversy at the moment about, were the figures overblown? Was the model that was initially produced those very striking estimates of potential death? Was the model any good? But anyways, certainly we've decided to take a more precautionary approach, an approach that differs, for example, than from Sweden or Belarus or something. And yeah, I mean, people are just trying to do their best. Most people, okay, this is what we've decided to do. We've all got to get on board, and the vast majority of people have done that. I mean, nobody knows the answer, right? So, most people think, as a good citizen, that's what I should do in the absence of any other clear kind of pathways. Now, that goodwill may subside slightly if we see that there isn't a clear exit strategy. I mean, you can give up quite a lot for a short period of time. But there are lots of people who are giving up quite a lot. And people who live in a very small, cramped accommodation with lots and lots of people. Even I live in this is my office. Like, I can feel both walls. um, and, you know, if the police continue to be, they've been better now, but there's all these stories about police being heavy-handed. And again, it's not clear because we're all so online now that it's hard to tell if an isolated incident has been overblown because nobody's leaving their house to kind of say otherwise. Anyway, so it's that goodwill may begin to subside if the policy is seen to be ineffective or ill thought through. But for the time being, I mean, people are just doing their best. They're doing what they think is right. And I think also, I wrote about this recently, I think coronavirus also represents a kind of a common enemy that's a bit more unambiguous than have been our common enemies in the past. And a society that has no goals, no clear future-oriented project often needs a common enemy. And we've been floundering about for that for a long time. So something like this, which is it's not going to tell its own side of the story, it's not going to claim to be misunderstood, is in many ways the perfect thing to bring people together.
So do you think it will bring people together, or do you think it may result in a sort of confusion because it's not a clearly defined enemy as we've been used to in the past?
Well, even clearly defined enemies in the past have not necessarily brought people together, with the exception of perhaps the Nazis and to a lesser degree the Soviets. So I've been noticing quite a bit of nostalgia in the coverage and in political speeches. I mean, it's hard to ignore, obviously, the harking back to the Blitz spirit and that sort of thing. You know, it's harking back to a time when we knew the bad people were bad. And, you know, it is unambiguous. It's a virus that it's not like a community somewhere. You know, our wars in the Middle East, for example, it's been quite ambiguous. People will tell their own side of the story, and it's sort of like, well, are we the bad guys here? You know, is it us? And now it's sort of like, well, we can all come together. And like, obviously online, there's like a lot of conspiracy. There are a lot of conspiracy theories going around. But I think the vast majority of people are indeed coming together. In fact, like, you know, you do the sort of 8 p.m. clap for carers thing. You know, it's the first time that I've actually like interacted with my neighbors, ironically. Like the fact that we're not meant to and we're quite distant from each other, sort of like waving and talking from the doorstep. And there is that sense of community. Now, I think it's transient. It's not going to, you know, it's an enemy that hopefully will fade, and we're still left with that vacuum in society of meaning and purpose. But for the time being, I think it's filled that vacuum quite a lot.
I researched your views quite a lot going into this interview, and I get the sense from you that you think that we too often talk about our social problems in society as being the result of personal shortcomings to do with our own happiness or perhaps mental well-being, when we should instead be looking at them as being born out of wider structural difficulties. Do you think that picture is likely to then change as a result of what's going on in the world at the moment?
That will be more likely to look at things structurally?
Yes.
I'm not totally sure. I mean, like usually after a crisis, so we know that an economic crisis is going to result from this, right? So usually when there's a crisis, there's an ideological onslaught that tries to blame some group in society for the crisis. So, you know, on the left, it's greedy bankers. On the right is lazy Greeks. And even weird leftists that love the EU will still say that. They're like, left, oh, now I'm a neoliberal, Greeks are lazy. Anyway, and so there's always this sort of like ideological war against some group in society that gets the blame. Now, what's interesting about this particular crisis is that it's combined with apparently something that's natural, something that isn't anybody's fault. And therefore, I'm not sure, but it may be more difficult to ask people to take the blame and shoulder the burden, because it's like, I didn't do anything wrong. I wasn't profligate. I stayed in, I did what I was told, and now I'm being asked to suffer for years after this? No, I'm not going to do that. On the other hand, it may be that it's sort of like, well, you know, these were special circumstances, and to avoid millions of dead, now we have to have a 10-year depression, and you must bear the burden for that. How dare you complain about your consumption levels when people are dying? You know, so I'm not 100% sure what the narrative is going to be. And of course, another possible narrative is that perhaps we may see the rebirth of a more structural understanding of social problems and of economic crisis, where people may be more open to understanding the deeper roots of the issue and ask questions about why the global economy was not able to stand up and still provide for people when essential workers are still working for the most part. Why are we not able to carry on as a society? Perhaps people may ask these kinds of questions. I am not all that optimistic. I don't know. I mean, we've been so individualized for such a long time, so used to thinking about social problems in terms of individual frailty, that I imagine that this narrative may continue. And it's a very, very difficult narrative to upend, I think. And I'm still trying to figure out why that is and how to subvert it.
Earlier on, you talked about affirming fear. I wanted to pick up on that. I just forgot to with the last couple of questions. Do you think we are being too fearful as a society at the moment of this?
Are we being, well, it's not, the thing is that it's a fear of the unknown, right? So it's very difficult to know whether or not we are being too fearful because we don't know the nature of the threat. And obviously, as sociologists, when we study risk aversion and panic and so on, we're often doing so with the luxury of hindsight. So we know that that policies were overblown. You know, for example, the whole like crack baby epidemic of the 90s, you know, at the time, it was, you know, if you were to say, look, this is a moral panic, people get very angry with you. They'd say, babies are dying, you know. But of course, with the benefit of hindsight, we can see that, no, this was a completely constructed epidemic and loads of minority groups suffered and are still suffering because of it. But we know that now because we've had several decades and it's not so volatile. It's not so close to people's hearts. It's in the past. And so I can easily talk about that example in my classes without getting any of my students angry. But if you were to talk about something that's quite fresh, it's hard. And you may be wrong. You know, so it's difficult to weigh up whether or not people are, whether or not we're being asked to panic too much. I will say, however, that one thing that I've noticed is that there has been a cultural expectation pre-existing this, that no one ever dies. Like no one ever dies from something that isn't completely preventable. So they'll talk, people will like freak out about, you know, heart disease is the #1 killer, or cancer, you know, 1 in 2 people are going to get cancer now. Gosh, there must be something in the water. It's the plastics. And it's like, no, it's because we're getting old. And you don't write on a death certificate, died of old age. You always die of something. And then the stats will show like all the leading killers, and doesn't really give you the full picture of the fact that, well, it's because we're getting old. And if you die of a stroke, or you die of heart disease. And so I've been noticing this as well when policymakers, whenever they're honest about the fact that this will kill people, everyone goes up in arms. 1 death is too many. Well, I'm afraid that we're talking about mitigation here now. We're not able to contain it anymore. People will die. And that is the very sad truth. And it's almost like that's got to be some kind of political failing. But of course, we don't put the number of deaths every year from every cause at the front page of the newspaper or the first 5 minutes of a newscast. We'd all become basket cases if that was the case. And in fact, some of us are basket cases because that's all over social media. Like I know, like as a parent, people feel like it's their duty to post an article every time a child dies. So like I talk to my sister and I'm like, oh, you know, I really want to give my daughter some freedom. You know, I want to make sure that, you know, she, like when we were kids, you know, we went out and we played and we just, you know, we played out in the forest. And she's like, yeah, my friend's daughter, they let her go out and she got hit by a truck. And now I'm like, well, my kid's not leaving the house. Like, you know, and so we are basket cases when we hear about these things all the time. And it's very hard to put these things into context and to say, well, that is actually extraordinarily rare. You know, you shouldn't really be fearful of that sort of thing. But it's also seen as, in our culture, it's seen as our responsibility to worry about any and all risk. The responsible citizen is aware of risks and does everything that they can to mitigate against those. And now you can't be aware of any and all risk. It's impossible to live your life. There's a good quote from, I can't remember if it's Seneca, no one can live a good life who thinks too much about prolonging it.
So what about the role of the media here, Ashley? Clearly, many media outlets are covering coronavirus 24/7 to keep people updated on what's going on. But isn't there a danger that such intense coverage of this can actually exacerbate people's anxieties to a seriously unhealthy degree then?
Well, I'm not saying that people should like tell noble truths or something like that, or noble lies, and keep people in the dark. I mean, this is an exceptional situation. It is it's on the public agenda because it is exceptional. It's not like there were. I'm not sure. I haven't studied this, but I assume that there weren't like groups in society campaigning to put this at the front of the news agenda. I mean, it's there was a whistleblower that started the whole thing as well. So it's not like the typical kind of panic where groups in society come together and campaign to bring some formerly obscure risk to the attention of people, and then they're competing against a million other people who are doing the same thing. And so the incentive is to big up your risks, right? So you may be organized around an issue that's small but very pressing and very important, and you think it's very important. And so what you'll do is you'll come up with a definition of your problem that's very expansive because you don't want to leave anybody out. And you're also competing against tons of other people for the attention of policymakers and maybe the public, for their support, maybe their donations and that kind of thing. And so you'll say like 1 in 12, that doesn't work. 1 in 10, that doesn't work. 1 in 4. And then, if you look at the definition, it's just got more and more expansive over time. But when people look at that, go, oh, it's getting worse and worse and worse. Act now, act now. People do that all the time with tons of issues. And I think that is pretty nefarious. And that causes a lot of unnecessary panic. So one very contentious one would be suicide. So people will say like suicide is the leading cause of death among young people. And you're like, oh my gosh, it's like a really big problem. Now, obviously it is a problem. It's awful when this sort of thing happens, but you have to put that into context. It's the leading killer because young people don't die of anything else. It's very rare it's very, very rare for young people to die of something. So if something does kill them, it's violence and suicide, not because our society is necessarily much more violent or depressing than has ever been the case in the past, but because we're not dying of infectious disease as we would have done in the past. So if you always have to put these in context, or like recently they're saying, oh, suicide is increased by huge amounts. Every time there's like a little blip, they'll only look at the small little area around the blip and they'll say it's 3 times as much as it was 3 years ago. But then if you look at the long-term trend, it looks like this. And actually it's huge, like there's a big peak in the 70s and then it goes like that. And also they changed the definition of suicide and made it slightly easier to categorize deaths as suicide. So there was a blip around 2018 across many age groups. They don't say that, right? They'll say, no, it's, and I couldn't believe it too, because I was like, really? Suicide is one of those things that doesn't change a lot. That's surprising. So, because I heard claims makers making this case. And so I went and looked at the stats and said, oh, they don't say that the definition changed. They just make it sound like more people really did kill themselves over a shorter period of time. And so, yeah, that's, again, it's very fresh and it will make people angry by saying that. But you always need to put statistics in context and to weigh them up against other risks. Now, this issue is slightly different. When people try to put it into context and compare it to the flu, people get mobbed. And again, I don't know. Hindsight will tell us. And it will take some time for it to be less raw and for us to be able to look back and really sort out. And actually, we may never know because of the enormous measures taken by governments. We may never know if our fear was proportionate.
3 weeks ago in an article, you wrote that COVID-19 is an unprecedented health crisis without turning it into a psychological one. Could you explain what you meant by that?
Yeah, so I noticed that, so obviously, like the kind of research that I do, the targeted advertising will send me like they think that I'm like constantly looking for mental health support because I look at like well-being research and so on. And I noticed that I was getting these ads on Facebook that they were always the same ads that I get from these online counseling companies. And I noticed that the advertisements were starting to be geared toward coronavirus. So it was like anxious about the state of the world, uncertain about the future, talk to a counselor today for just $70 a week. And another one was there was like advertisements for like mindfulness therapy, like we have a new section just for coronavirus guided meditation. And there was a hypnotherapist that was advertising to like hypnotize your stress away. So there were all sorts of these sort of therapeutic entrepreneurs that were gearing their wares toward coronavirus. Now, obviously, that's definitely going to happen. Everybody has had to gear their wares toward coronavirus. I feel bad for journalists. I do a tiny bit of journalism myself, and not wanting to stick my neck out on this because I really don't know, and I don't know what's going to happen. I've had to sort of write before I'm prepared to do so. And that article is one example. So I understand that that's part of it, but I just found it very interesting. The more that I looked into it, the more it was being reconceptualized, not only as a public health crisis, but also as an unprecedented mental health crisis. So Prince Harry and Meghan were talking about it as a serious mental health crisis. You had in the United States, claims makers, governors, and so on talking about the need to remove some of the controls around prescribing psychiatric medications, to deal with the certain mental health problems that people are going to have as a result of this. And I just thought, well, okay, yeah, for people with existing mental health conditions, certainly there are going to be problems. Human beings are social beings. We need to be around other people. It's not nice to be in isolation. And if you already have mental health problems, it's going to be much worse. And there are certain groups in society that are going to suffer in many, many ways. So, one area was like the homeless population, not only put at great health risk, but also having serious pre-existing mental health conditions. Again, serious issue. However, what I was noticing is that simply the fear, anxiety, and uncertainty associated with the issue was being cast as a mental health problem, something that requires treatment by a trained professional. And that is a trend that I have noticed in relation to a huge range of human emotion, where not just our quote unquote negative emotions, even like emotions that you have, uncertainty, fear, and so on, get redefined as mental health problems, but also our positive emotions are redefined as things that require expert honing, that we don't really have the knowledge nor our expertise to take care of our own happiness, well-being, or mental health, that these things require specialized expertise. And you can see this kind of leaking into human relationships, where I've been a little bit disturbed to notice sometimes that people will say things to each other like, oh, well, I'm not qualified to deal with that problem. I'm not going to do that emotional labor. And I was like, boy, that gives a really like progressive sheen to being a dick. Like, that gives a progressive sheen to being a not very nice person in a relationship with somebody. I mean, like, what have human beings done throughout history in situations of war and upset and so on? You have certain narratives as a community, you have certain symbols through which you make sense of your situation, and those are shared between individuals within a group. And I feel like we have that less and less now. There's less certainty with how we're supposed to respond to a situation. We've lost tradition. We've lost a sense of, shared religion. I'm not mourning that. I'm just saying that that's what's happened. And so without these scripts available to make sense of our situation, increasingly we draw on professionalized and therapeutic scripts, which have where, the Bible would have had the authority of God. These scripts have the authority of greater or lesser sciences behind them. And so they have this sense of truth. And so we say, well, that's the correct way to respond, that this is, this is truly an illness and I'm experiencing these symptoms. But of course, like if you look at the history of a lot of these categories, they have a tendency to expand. So more and more aspects of human experience come under the umbrella of illness, and we are increasingly encouraged to think about our feelings through a medical lens, a process we call medicalization in sociology. And so more and more our feelings have become medicalized. And so I've seen this happening also with coronavirus, just this sort of everyday kind of uncertainty, anxiety, and so on, with that has a material basis, is seen as something that, yes, okay, it's a material thing, but really what you can control and what you ought to attend to is your own self-care. So then reaching out to a family member over Skype becomes not just this good way to like talk to that family member and ensure they're not too lonely and so on. It becomes like a form of mental health support. a kind, or even a kind of self-care, which turns it into something else entirely. It becomes this sort of set of prescribed actions that you take in the same way that you might take a medication for an illness. And in that way, it removes something of a social understanding of the issue. And also, like, the way that you define an issue determines or invites a particular solution. So if the problem is medical, the solution is medical. If the problem is economic, the solution is economic. But I've been noticing increasingly that even economic problems, why do they matter? Well, because they're bad for people's mental health. Well, an economic problem is bad enough. You don't need to translate it into a mental health problem. And doing so dangerously brings it into the realm of health and illness and invites those solutions.
Do you think that it's appropriate to view this whole crisis and the impact it's having as being the result of an out-of-the-blue externality, or do you think it perhaps says or exposes something deeper about the way our economy functions?
Oh, of course, it's not an externality. It simply accelerated a process that was going to happen anyway. I've been trying to get my head around this, the economic base of this crisis. And so I'm at a very early point in that. And so what I say now will most likely change. But from what I can see and what I have been seeing for several years, like obviously every Marxist predicts, what is it, the joke, we predict 20 out of the last 10 crises. We're always saying a crisis is coming. And I am one of these people, apparently, because I have been saying that a crisis is coming. So what happened was, prior to and during the 1930s, there was a tendency in crises not to intervene, at least not to the extent that we do now. So during the 19th century, there were Great Depressions, or there was a Great Depression, but there were many, obviously there were many recessions before the 1930s. And the approach to dealing with these was far less interventionist. And what happened in the 1930s, however, was by allowing the economy to contract so incredibly violently, produced a number of consequences. And one of those consequences was radicalization of a large portion of the working class. So you had almost had revolutions in Spain, for example, and even in Greece. In the 1940s, the partisan armies in Greece were forced to disarm, and then you had military dictatorships after that suppressed this working class attempt to revolt against the ruling class. So people, they didn't stand for it. A lot of people didn't stand for the massive contraction and the effect that it had on their lives, the enormous unemployment, uncertainty, and destruction, which was, by the way, almost completely unnecessary and artificial. It's not that there was a famine or a blight or something. It's that paradoxically there were too many commodities, not in the sense of human need, obviously, when people were starving, but that could be sold profitably. And it was laid bare, more or less, for all to see. I mean, there's a wonderful image, not wonderful, horrible image in Grapes of Wrath, for example, of these people who are starving, and there's food everywhere. And they can hear the pigs being slaughtered, thrown into a ditch and covered with lye. As they're starving, they hear this happening. Why? Because they can't be sold profitably. And that was a radicalizing moment. And then obviously you had the Second World War that came out of that, and which ended with the real threat of nuclear annihilation across the world. And so if you follow the kind of understanding of crisis that I do, that kind of destruction is not an accident, it's not incidental, but is necessary in order to allow for a new round of accumulation, that is investment, profitable investment, and another boom. And what's scary is that think about the level of destruction that the 1930s and 1940s saw, and that only produced a boom for about 2 decades. 2.5 decades. And that's terrifying. And so what's happened is that since then, governments have been less likely to allow for that level of destruction. They've been less likely to pick fights with global powers. You have the nature of war has changed. You don't necessarily go to war against states anymore. And people have been unwilling to pick fights with states because of mutually assured destruction, but it is quote unquote necessary. That kind of destruction would be wonderful for the crisis of capitalism, the ongoing crisis of capitalism, wherein it's very, very difficult to invest profitably in production. And so what people do is like, why would you bother investing in like shoes or the actual production of commodities when you can very, very profitably give people debt and, or student loans that they have to pay you back, right? But of course, at the end of the day, all of those loans have to be paid back with some kind of human productive activity. So if nobody's investing in human productivity, all we're getting is these enormous bubbles, and the bubbles are going to burst. And so what would be wonderful for capitalism? Well, an enormous contraction. It's not even like what would be wonderful, it's what needs to happen. But and I keep saying, like, I don't mean it needs to happen like, oh, it would be good. That the human destruction is totally artificial and it's unnecessary from my point of view. But it needs to happen in order to allow capitalism to continue to be profitable. But governments have been unwilling to do that. So with the previous crisis, they papered over it with an enormous amount of debt. And we just see people clamoring for another bubble because, well, it's a good thing for human beings. A bubble is wonderful. The problem is it's a terrible thing for capitalism when the bubble bursts. And so I feel like this kind of contraction is a necessity for capitalism at the moment. And perhaps if enough small businesses go out of business, you could buy them up very, very cheaply and very, very profitably. We may have a massive consolidation of capital into fewer and fewer hands. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is a bad thing for capitalism. Capitalism works best in the form of many small capitals, but the system itself tends toward monopoly in crisis. So the people who are stronger, the companies that are stronger, are able to buy up the smaller failing companies. And so this was inevitable, more or less. It was going to happen. We have been seeing serious profitability crises. And I've been noticing too, part of my research and what got me onto this was this tendency for people to begin to downplay, and when I say people, I mean governments, to downplay economic growth, not because they're like, oh, you know what, it doesn't make us happy. I just realized, what's all this growth for? It's not happening. It's like countries have been experiencing very sluggish growth for a long time. And so, of course, it's natural and rational to downplay it. But of course, it's not like countries are like pulling the strings, like, oh, why don't we have some economic growth? Let's just have some economic growth. It's like policies that are attempting to directly influence economic growth often fail. And attempts to get out of recession are not like simply as reflections of human will. It's quite uncertain how we do that. So I think that this is simply a crisis that was coming anyway, perhaps may act as a justification for massive capital destruction that hadn't been available in previous crises. So people would be unwilling to accept the level of unemployment that is necessary to make capitalism perhaps profitable again, and maybe they will now. I'm not entirely sure. I'm still rethinking a lot of that analysis that I just gave, but that's where I am right now.
So let me put you in a position that you maybe don't want to be in, which is in Boris Johnson's shoes. If you're Boris Johnson, the lockdown ends, you're Prime Minister, what then are your priorities? What should you be thinking about?
Oh, I'm very glad that I'm not in that position. I don't think these are easy questions. Now, if I was Boris Johnson, I'd have different priorities, I imagine. But if I were myself in power, I'd be hiding under a duvet, I imagine. No, I honestly don't know. I do know that no matter what, the working people must be willing and able and ready to organize to protect their living standards, and to absolutely reject any and all attempts to justify having a crisis paid for on our backs, with our lives, with our futures, with our children's futures. No matter the justification, we have extraordinary productive forces available to us as human beings across the world. And these are capable of producing a very good standard of living for all people. We have a problem in that we are not really able to direct those forces of production toward the creation of our better lives and freedom for us, because that's not their point. Their purpose is to create profit. And if they can't create profit, they will rest and we will starve. And it's to recognize that this is artificial. It appears as a natural problem now. It appears as though it came out of nowhere, nothing that we could do. It's a virus, it's a natural external shock, but that's not the case. This crisis was coming anyway, and we need to fight against the ideological onslaught that will attempt to get us to pay for it. And I think people are doing that now. I think people are saying, like, they're unwilling to accept enormous job losses that are happening right now. They're saying, no, well, I didn't do anything wrong here. My company didn't do anything wrong. It's not that we were weak, and it's creative destruction and so on. And so I hope that the virus, while it may be used against us as a reason to say, yeah, just accept less, it may also be a reason to say, no, I won't accept less because it's not something that I did. So I don't know what I would do in power, but certainly as a working person, and my husband is like a delivery driver, so he's an essential worker. Suddenly, I know that anytime that anybody will try to get me to give up my freedom and my future and my children's future and that of other workers, I will fight it tooth and nail. As you do, when you go on strike, that's what you do. We often forget that. We're sort of infected by anti-consumerism on the left. But it's important not to allow that to become an onslaught against our living standards and a way of forcing us to accept precariousness, poor work, lack of work, insecure work, and so on.
Just on that theme, you've been critical of left-wingers who you see as being too willing to treat people as vulnerable subjects rather than appealing to their sense of aspiration or self-interest. But isn't it going to be very difficult for a lot of people on the left to not treat politics as a charity campaign, as you yourself put it in a recent podcast, when there are so many people who are in precarious situations now because of this crisis?
Yeah, but just being in a precarious situation doesn't make you a victim in need of like a charitable donation. I mean, as the defining feature of who you are and why we should worry about you. I mean, obviously we need a welfare safety net. Obviously charities play an important role in society, but that cannot be the be all and the end all. And that certainly cannot be our overriding ideology for why we organize and how we run our politics. People don't want to be treated like that. It's not like, we're not like, you think about these like Victorian ladies, the the wives of the factory owners that used to go out into the working class areas, and like they had so much love and desire and love for these people and desire to help them, so long as they were worthy victims, so long as they were the deserving poor. If you were like crotchety, drank a bit too much and so on, well, forget about you. If you were like those problem families, or now, the problem families and so on, well, forget about you. We have this like very rosy, what's the word I'm looking for? Like rosy idea of the working class. And if people don't fit that, well, you are deplorable. You are, if you're not willing to accept that label as the downtrodden and the poor and the trying so hard to feed our family and so on. Like I came from like one of these problem families, like I remember talking to somebody who was like, we grew up and we were so poor. I remember my mom being so just the tears in her eyes when she couldn't give us the food she wanted to give us. And I was thinking like, yeah, that would have been nice. That would have been nice. I think I probably got yelled at for asking for more than bologna and white bread for dinner. But what would have helped our situation? Not like these people coming in and trying to tell us how to be parents and so on. It would have been money and security, and an agency. We just felt passive. I know that my mother probably felt passive, and the only like outlet that she had for where she had a sense of agency that she could lift herself out of where she was probably gambling. And I recognize that, and I don't think it's helpful to kind of treat people as though they're victims. I think that what she probably was crying out for was a sense of control over her life, which we didn't have. We're like just thrown about by forces beyond our control. And loads of people in the world feel that way. And where do you get your agency now within capitalism? You get it in the workplace. You get it through having secure work. And now, of course, that is constantly being trampled on because you don't really have agency in the workplace, right? You're not like, you know, have control over your work. But that is where you express your human creativity, not when you're sort of sitting at home, like watching TV or something like that. There's this good line in, I think it's in the Grundrisse, where Marx talks about the contradiction of capitalism, where as human beings we are creative and we express our agency through our creativity. And that is like no small thing. Like through our human activity on the world, we transform what we are as human beings. Like we transform our entire nature. And yet we become alienated from that. You know, famously, we are alienated from our species being, which is from the 1844 manuscripts. But he says, paradoxically, we feel ourselves only when we are not working. And when we are working, we do not feel ourselves. And now that is a bad thing. That is a bad thing. That's something that we should be fighting against. It's not something that we acquiesce to. Oh, I don't feel myself when I'm at work, so let's sort of get our agency from like state handouts or something like that. Now, it sounds like I'm kind of questioning the welfare state. I am not. I'm at this point now where I'm not 100% sure where society is going, and I can kind of see like the rational kernel in the state taking over such a huge portion of our welfare. You know, it almost seems like a stone's throw away from socialism if you know, a proper working class movement could take over the state. You know, you could see how we might be able to more rationally organize production. So I'm not necessarily like, you know, saying that whole project is useless, but just to think that state-provided welfare is the be-all and the end-all without that organized working class movement seeking to rationally direct production, I think that's the mistake, to put all your hope in the state without realizing that the state itself is a capitalist state and it's not there to free workers. You need to have both of those things. The recognition of the working class as agents, that's who is ultimately going to try to rationally direct production. We are going to be the producers and so on. To leave that whole side out and just think of it as us being passive and receiving our consumption from the state, I think that may be the mistake. But as I said, I'm at this point where I'm rethinking everything. So it's very difficult to talk about these things at the moment, but that's kind of where I am, literally my train of thought at the moment.
Last question, Ashley. You've also been critical of people who you see as being too judgmental of others, shall we say? People, for instance, who post images on social media of other people and go, look at these idiots, because they're not closely following the government's guidance on social distancing. Why have you been so critical of those people?
Well, if you look at some of the polls and studies that have been done, I mean, Brits on the whole have been pretty compliant. And I just wonder why there's this glee with pointing these people out. And I don't know, but it seems to me like there's some kind of, I mean, people are able to weigh up risks. And that's the issue, is that there's a tendency to think that, particularly in policy, to assume that people can't do that. And it's true, it's very hard to weigh up risks, but people do. They think logically, even if they eventually come to the wrong conclusion. But that's what people do. And it's very hard to get around that just by saying, all right, well, forget about it. We're not going to let people weigh up risks. We're just going to give them a simple message: stay home, save lives, protect the NHS, and so on. But then people will say, well, if the point is to stop the spread of the virus, why can't I go out into a park? You know, and it's like, well, just don't do it. Just don't do it. Well, if you don't want people to do it, you kind of have to say why, you know, what's going to happen. Instead, it was like, no, we're just going to crack down on you. And then it was like, well, why can't you people just follow the rules? Just follow the rules. Well, it's because people are kind of thinking for themselves. And they may be coming to the wrong conclusion, but that's what people do. They sort of weigh up risks. And like the image of the older people that were walking the Peak District, I think, with their dog. I mean, those people seem to have made a pretty good judgment about risk. Like when I walk my dog through the neighborhood now, there are lots of people out on the street. It would be great to go a little bit further. I don't have a car though, but it would be great to do that. And I think that, you know, logically that person probably said, well, I'm going to be very, very far from other people. And I suspect that part of the reason why that elicited so much outrage, and particularly in the officers who were controlling the drone and thought that it was, clear evidence of someone doing the wrong thing. The reason why they felt so strongly about that and to put it up on Twitter was probably because it was quite nice. It was probably quite enjoyable. And nobody right now should be seen outside their home enjoying. Enjoyment is seen as unnecessary. And I think that's part of health moralism. So health moralism has become increasingly the morality of contemporary society. And it has historically always had an ambivalent relationship to enjoyment. So you can't say, for example, that you smoke because you like smoking. Like, you can't just be like, well, that's my thing. I just like smoking. It's really nice. I do. I say, like, yeah, I just like smoking. I don't do it very often because I like it so much. I'm too Catholic. I smoke like twice a year because it's so wonderful. It's a very lovely thing to do every now and then. You can't say that. It's like, oh my gosh, how could you say that? Because against the value of health, any kind of enjoyment falls flat. Any kind of freedom falls flat. And so you see this sort of, outside of coronavirus, you see this proliferation of like a harm industry, because we all know that the end of freedom is harm to someone else, right? So the goal in a lot of movements, if it infringes on freedom, is to create some kind of health problem around something. And we see that a lot. And so health moralism, like if anybody wants to justify something, like, oh, it's good for your health. Or like, we can't just say an economic crisis is bad. We have to say it's bad for people's health. You don't need to say it's bad for people's health to say that like human misery and like not being able to find a job, searching for a job forever, doesn't need to literally kill you to be a bad thing. It doesn't need to make you mentally ill for it to be a bad thing, but we're losing that, So I think part of the reason why we're taking these pictures and we get so outraged is because we're seeing that contradiction between enjoyment and health, which our culture has a lot of trouble dealing with at the moment. We find it very difficult to justify anything outside of a health, of a morality of health.
Ashley, thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you.